The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. He has been very threatening beyond a normal statement. And as I said, they will be met with fire, fury, and frankly power, the likes of which this world has never seen before. I think without the rhetoric, it wouldn't have happened. I think without other things going along, I think the establishment of a new team was very important. They have a great team, but I think he wants to get it done. I really feel that very strongly.
From fire and fury to friends, right now President Trump is in the air making a 25-hour, 10,000-mile journey back to Washington, D.C. It has been a whirlwind few hours of nuclear negotiations, but the final results of the Singapore summit will take much longer to determine. Well,
it's going to take many months and many meetings to see if this process is real in the sense of achieving the complete denuclearization that was announced as the achievement of this opening round, or the commitment of this opening round. This is an enormous triumph for Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader. He has built a nuclear force that has been his leverage in these talks. He's stared down President Trump. Remarks about fire and fury. Kim Jong-un kept going, and he got to this point. And he has in President Trump someone who seems to have a real investment in Kim Jong-un's success. Working with him, so many flattering terms about him. So thinking about what he sees as the biggest stumbling blocks ahead as we try to flesh out this very loose initial framework agreement.
This is a very loose initial framework. Frankly, it does not really advance the ball. It doesn't go as far as previous statements. And frankly speaking, I think the next step should be Mike Pompeo sort of forgetting about this statement, chalking up this whole summit to a sort of feel-good atmospherics, and getting on with some kind of action plan. I think Mike Pompeo is going to be under the gun to kind of lay out what it is we need to do. For example, this statement says nothing at all about the regional powers. Is South Korea or is China, is Japan, are they going to be partners in this process? Are we going to carry on with a bilateral process? What's their role going to be? So a lot of questions like this. And if I were Mike Pompeo, I'd get moving on a sort of action plan, how to negotiation, because when you start looking at the statement, putting aside the syntactical problems and the whole thing, you'll see that it has some major problems, and frankly is an invitation for the North Koreans to do nothing, and nothing, I should say, in our lifetime.
And the key tactical questions are, can Mike Pompeo be unleashed to be a tough-minded negotiator? Can we keep South Korea and Japan with us? Is China going to help or hurt? And so I think you've got to use the allies. They have to be part of this, particularly South Korea, given its the existential stakes about its future.
I certainly would agree with Nick that this is a good thing that these two leaders met, that it does break ice, that it does create a personal relationship. I must say I was a little taken aback by the North Korean flags and the American flag side by side. We really aren't side by side. We aren't equals to each other. And this conferred power to Kim Jong-un that I don't believe he has yet earned in terms of the respect from the United States. That's something that comes through building that relationship. As far as the agreement is concerned, I went back and looked at the previous agreements. The 1992 North-South Agreement on Joint Declaration on denuclearization was very specific. No nukes, no facilities, inspections. The agreed framework that was done during the Clinton administration by Bob Gallucci was very specific. Close down the reactor until we get new light water reactors, non-proliferation proof. In fact, what Chris Hill did was extraordinary. The verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, verifiable in the September 2005 deal, and it actually broke down over verification. So we have not only been here before, but we have been here before with much greater specificity. So Mike Pompeo needs to go back and understand a little bit more about history, and he needs to go forward with a team that knows what they're doing.
So Mike Pompeo did say they would take whatever they put together to the Senate. Any regrets not doing that with the Iran deal in some ways?
No regrets. The Congress did get to decide on the Iran deal. There hasn't been a treaty agreed to except a follow-on new start to the START treaty for years now in the Senate. When Bob Dole, the former leader of the Senate, sat in his wheelchair on the floor of the United States Senate to try to get the disabilities treaty through, who could be against a disabilities treaty? It didn't happen. So treaties are difficult. And the other thing about these very complicated reciprocal agreements, the Iran deal is 110 pages,
right,
is a treaty doesn't make it easy to look at reciprocal steps and pull back if necessary. It's a different kind of an instrument. So the Congress did get to decide on the Iran deal. It was an interesting process. And so I'm all for them having to take this as a treaty to the Senate, but they'll fail if they do so.
But isn't that what is required? So our allies, our friends and our enemies will know that there will be consistency in our foreign policy regardless of who is sitting in the Oval Office.
In principle, I agree. It doesn't have to be in the form of a treaty. There's lower thresholds, just majority votes with executive agreements, which are probably politically more realistic. I like the idea of hearings on these issues, so the administration has to defend what it's done. What we had here in Singapore is not enough to subject to that process. It'd be the shortest hearing in history. You'd need a fleshed out agreement, and that's the sort of thing I agree with you, Joe. It ought to be presented if and when we ever get to that point, but that will require that Mike Pompeo and his colleagues do an enormous amount of negotiations about what the obligations are, about timelines, about verification, and I think there's real issues again about what we are prepared to put up there. And some people have criticized this for the lack of focus on human rights. That's a legitimate question. But I think even more legitimate are the other military threats that North Korea poses outside the nuclear. What about chemical? What about biological? What about artillery? What about special forces? And I think all of this needs to be thought through. We can't have a narrow concern just about nuclear weapons and long-range missiles, because that's all about us. And the South Koreans and the Japanese have legitimate interests in other threats posed by North Korea. But I agree with your basic point. This is exactly the role that Congress should be playing. They should be putting all this ultimately under a microscope. Right now what they could do, by the way, is hold hearings and talk about what should go into an agreement rather than wait for one. Why doesn't Congress begin to shape the process? They don't have to just sit there for the next year or two. They could pass a resolution. They could have hearings. They could be basically giving ideas to the administration about what they want to see there in order for them to be prepared to approve it.
Timetable do you envision for the denuclearization? And in the meantime, are you thinking about easing any sanctions?
Well, scientifically, I've been watching and reading a lot about this, and it does take a long time to, pull off complete denuclearization. It takes a long time. Scientifically, you have to wait certain periods of time, and a lot of things happen. But despite that, once you start the process, it means it's pretty much over. You can't use them. That's the good news. And that's going to start very, very soon. I believe that's going to start very soon. We will do it as fast as it can mechanically and physically be done. The sanctions will come off when we are sure that the nukes are no longer a factor. Sanctions played a big role.
Mr. President, this joint statement does not talk about verifiable or irreversible denuclearization. Is that a concession on the part of the United States?
No, not at all, because if you look at it, it said we are going to, let's say here, it will be gone. I don't think you can be any more plain than what we're asking. Issues related to the establishment of the new U.S.-DPKR relations, the building. We talk about the guarantees, and we talk about unwavering commitment to the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. This is the document that we just signed.
Did you discuss with Chairman Kim methods to verify, either with the United States or international organizations, that very process?
Yes, we did. Yes, we did. And we'll be verifying. Yeah, we'll be verifying. It'll be verified. Well, it's going to be achieved by having a lot of people there. And as we develop a certain trust, and we think we have done that. Secretary Pompeo has been really doing a fantastic job, his staff, everybody. As we do that, we're going to have a lot of people there, and we're going to be working with them on a lot of other things, but this is complete denuclearization of North Korea, and it will be verified.
Will those people be Americans or international?
Combinations of both. Combinations of both, and we have talked about it.
So